Hello everyone, and welcome in the second webinar of the webinar series connected to the MOOC on Essentials of Youth Work. My name is Marietta Balázs, and on behalf of the EU Council of Europe Youth Partnership, welcome every participant. Either you join through Zoom or through our Facebook. And we are looking forward to a very, very interesting conversation about ethics and values in youth work. So join in the conversation, let's stay in touch and enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Marietta. Welcome from my side. My name is Snezana. I'm one of the facilitators of the MOOC and one of the facilitators of this webinar. With me today, besides Marietta, there are also Darek and Katja, the colleagues who you will also hear and see at some point during the webinar. And as Marietta said, we have a very exciting and very dear to me topic today, which is ethics and values in youth work, or also ethics and values of youth workers. And we really have three amazing speakers. I know we say that every time, and this time it's also very true. Yeah, we have Slađa Petković, who will be our first speaker, and she will be speaking from the research perspective, but also Slađa is a long-term practitioner as well. We have John Taylor, who is joining us from Scotland, from a very rich practice and also the practice of digital youth work. And we have Juha Kiviniemi, another great practitioner and colleague, and who would also approach this topic from more digital youth work perspective. Yeah, so we have a really exciting minutes ahead of us. And what we will do is we will hear first all three panelists or all three speakers, let's say. And in the meantime, you can use the chat to have a conversation, but then we ask you to use Q&A to actually ask your questions. So we would actually invite you to start whenever you have a question, you just post it in the Q&A. We will be collecting them, and then when our three speakers finish, they will stay with us, and then we'll be reading your questions and they will be responding. And if you're watching us through Facebook, you can also post your comment there, and we will pick up the questions from there as well. This webinar is being recorded, so it will be later on available on the MOOC page. So for those who could not join us, they could watch it there. Yeah, I think this is from the basic information, and then I will not take any more of your time, but I will actually pass the mic to Slađa from her first input. Welcome, Slađa.
Thank you, Snezana. Hi, guys. Hi to all of the participants. Let me do this technical gymnastics and share my screen. It's really a great pleasure to share a bit of information and knowledge that my colleagues from the Pool of European Youth Researchers and I collected throughout the years. I personally want to share two things and findings from two pieces of research, let's put it that way. The one is, let me check how it works. I hope that you can see the screen, right? Yeah.
Yeah, we can, and we can see the change of slides, yeah.
Perfect, thank you. And you can see the avatar of me. Yeah, beauty of technology. Very strange version though. So basically I would like to focus on highlights of two pieces of research. One of them was conducted in 2017 and 18, and coordinated by the partnership between the Council of Europe and the Commission in the field of youth. Another piece of research was conducted last year during 2020, during COVID times, and it was really adventurous, but it was implemented within the Erasmus Plus program and coordinated by the Serbian National Association of Youth Workers called NAPOR. So both these researches are very much related. I'm going to explain how. And to start with just a bit of background of the first set of data that was collected by the partnership and the team of researchers working around the project that was focusing on mapping education and career pathways of youth workers. As I said, during 2017 and 18, there was a really great group of experts gathered around this project. And the main point was to really conduct, let's say, the pilot and preliminary mapping exercise, and to see how is the current state of play in more than 40 countries, I would say, across Europe and the Council of Europe member states, when it comes to systems that are supporting education and career pathways of youth workers. So the results of this massive mapping exercise were then analyzed and interpreted through a theoretical or let's say conceptual framework of practice architectures. And our dear colleague Tommy Kilakowski created a very good paper as well that was called Diversity of Practice Architectures. Why am I mentioning this? Because in the follow-up to these processes, 6 thematic papers were also developed based on the needs of the mapping. One of them was related to ethics. So I would say the good news in this process is that the topic of ethics basically came out as the demand, coming from the sector and from the research participants as such. So I would say that this is really kind of showing us that this topic is relevant and that the people really, and practitioners and policymakers really want and need to hear and learn more. So this very paper was created in 2018 by my colleague Ondra Barta and me, and it was published in the Youth Knowledge book that is also available online. So I really encourage you to explore all of these links. There are plenty of papers and reports uploaded, so you can really learn a lot in your own time, of course. Another piece of research that I want to shortly present is done in the follow-up phase of the previous, let's say, research project that was conducted by the partnership. And this one was conducted by NAPOR, as I already said, and it was implemented by various implementing partners. So the setting was very much international, I would say. And in this regard, it was very good news, because we learned a lot from this, let's say, comparative practice. Another news in this regard was the methodology. So the previous paper done in the context of the partnership was mainly based on desk research because it was a starting point. So we didn't have any point of reference. We needed basically to create, to set the ground. And in this follow-up phase, we had more liberty, let's say, and we also introduced some additional methods. We talked with key keynote speakers, for example, with key experts. Apart from doing desk research, there were also case studies coming from 3 countries. So I would say the approach was more practical and much more fun, I would say. Speaking of fun, I just want to share key findings and some results of the research. So the first set of information that I want to share is kind of coming as the result of desk research, and it's about ethical nature of youth work in general. And also it's about ethical standards and what is their purpose, what is their role in supporting quality youth work, and a bit about ethical issues and conflicts that we have identified. So basically what we learned is that ethical nature of youth work is embedded in the very definition of youth work. As we already know, there are plenty of definitions. So I provided only a few examples here in this blue section. But what is important is that various definitions point out to youth work as firstly social practice, but then ethical practice that is value-based in one way, and then that is relational on the other way. What does it mean that the youth work is value-based? It means that it has very, I would say, sometimes very serious, but inevitably it has moral, social, political, and many other consequences. And it's embedded in the set of general and universal values and principles that are equally influencing the practice, but also the policy and the way and the relations, for example. Another thing very important for this context is that we learned that there are various theories presenting and describing youth work as relational practice. This is particularly relevant for the case of Australia, I would say. And in this blue section, the bottom part, in the bottom part where my head is, you can see one of the definitions that mentions and describes youth work very much in the context of human rights, first of all, but also in the context of relations. And for example, it says that youth work as a practice that place young people in focus, first of all, but then youth work is relational practice where the youth workers operate alongside young person and their context. So this relation doesn't concern only, let's say, youth workers and young people, but also it concerns the entire environment in which the youth work is taking place. We are going to get back to this a bit later on. Why is this all important? It's important because speaking and understanding youth work as a social and ethical practice, we basically understand youth work as the social practice that has potential to form and transform not only individuals, but also the society as a whole. I would say that this is quite a high expectation, right, towards youth workers, first of all, but we are going to get to it later on as well. The interesting thing is also that the empirical data showed that the youth workers, practitioners, recognized these ethical features, I would say, in their practice. And for example, they describe themselves as those who are empowering young people, or those who have the mission to create change, or basically to influence young people's lives, and so on and so forth. So in a way, this understanding of youth work as such is also embedded in the minds of practitioners. The purpose and role of ethical standards is such that they basically provide various, they serve various purposes, let's put it that way. Firstly, these ethical standards could help youth work to define itself better, to define its role, to explain what youth work and youth workers are actually doing, and to kind of explain how youth work is relating to other professions. It's also addressing these boundaries and limitations of relations within the context of youth work, but also the relations of youth workers with the others, with the world. Let's say there are plenty of stakeholders that youth workers are inevitably relating with. What is also important to say that these ethical standards, in theory at least, are basically defined as, firstly, very general ethical principles and values, and then a bit more specific rules and policies. And then in the end, we have the third group of ethical standards that are basically concerning, let's say, moral qualities or dispositions, but we call it competencies in a wider sense, competencies of youth workers. So in theory, in literature, these three types of standards are mainly used. What is also important is that these standards are usually operationalized through different types of measures. There are three types of measures that are usually used. One of them is describing how youth workers are treating service users that are usually young people, right? Another type of measures is concerning the nature of this relationship. And the third type is explaining how the outcomes and effects of the welfare of the service users is achieved. So basically, the third type of measures is talking about the effects of youth work itself. These ethical standards are usually embedded in different sets of documents that we are going to call, in this context, codes of ethics. But there are various types of documents and they have different names and so on and so forth. Some examples are codes of conduct, codes of ethical practice, and so on. So basically, these documents have also a particular role to provide contextual framework for recognition of youth work and also framework for reflection and discussion on ethical issues in youth work, and also to identify ethical principles and values and also guidelines for improvement of practice. What we have learned from this initial mapping, we learned that these ethical codes, as we call them, could be of various types. Some of them are self-regulatory or voluntary, which means that they are created by the organizations themselves and for themselves. Some of them can refer to professional youth workers. Some of them could relate to volunteers or both groups. Another type of codes could be created and imposed by the public sector, meaning, let's say, some representative body or ministry or some institute and so on. Regardless of the type, the results of our thematic paper that was developed based on the mapping exercise was the following. We found that not so many countries basically have these ethical codes developed, or at least they were not available in English. That's one of the very important limitations, I would say. When it comes to the first group of countries from the first, let's say, type of practice architectures, which means that these countries have the mostly, have fully developed infrastructure for education and professional development of youth workers. Within this group, out of 11 countries, we found the codes, ethical codes, in only 4 countries. Again, codes only available in English and uploaded online were available to us. So this could mean that probably there are some other codes that are written in local language, that are published on some websites of the organizations, of syndicates even, and so on and so forth. So this is not the extensive list, right? This is just the finding of our mapping.
Slađo, just to know, 5 more minutes, okay?
Okay. Another thing is that we found out that in the group of countries with the practice architectures that need further development, we found also very limited number of codes. And then in the third group, we didn't find any code, which means that some kind of correlation, although we need to prove it scientifically, some kind of correlation could be found with the level of development of the support system when it comes to education and professional development of youth workers, and the level of development of the ethical frameworks, right? This is also confirmed by the latest findings from 2020. And this slide basically is telling us that, for example, in Baltic and Eastern European countries, but also in Western and Central European countries, the ethical codes that are developed are mainly developed by the organizations working across Europe. The situation is a bit different in Nordic countries, where these ethical standards are developed by the public sector. So they are kind of state-owned, and so on and so forth. Little organizations are also subscribed to their umbrella organizations that are developing standards for them, and so on and so forth. So I leave this to the participants to explore a bit more. And these are basically examples of values and principles. I'm not going to get into details. I'm going to also leave this as a handout to the participants. What is important to note is that values are very general. They're embedded and identified in most of the codes, of ethical codes. And their role is to provide this ethical foundation that informs professional practice, while the principles are a bit, let's say, specific. And the principles are basically those that are supporting the practice. Here are some examples of ethical principles that we have identified. So as you can see, young people need to be in focus of youth work, and then youth workers should treat young people with respect, and then they should work towards empowerment. There is this duty of care, privacy, confidentiality, the boundaries in terms of professional, private boundaries needs to be also taken in consideration and respected, of course, transparency, honesty, integrity, and so on and so on. There is a huge list. I would point out that these values and principles are not only considering the youth workers, they consider relation between young workers and young persons, but also relation of youth workers towards themselves. So they need to take care of their own integrity and their own well-being at first, and then to be able to provide this safe and safe background for the youth work practice. And this is how this is actually relevant for youth workers. In one way, implementation of this standard is providing a safe environment for youth work and provides integrity for all of the actors, but also it provides it helps and fosters, let's say, recognition and professionalization of youth work. Some conflicts and issues identify, as you can see, the general and specific types of issues and conflicts, and maybe the colleagues that are going to relate to practice could reflect on these. I would focus on specific conflicts that are related to the context in which youth work is taking place. They could be related to identity and the professional development of youth workers. They could be related to the relationship with young people and also relationship with other professions. That's really something that I would say each practitioner could relate to, more or less. Maybe I just want to scan through the case studies, but I really leave this to the participants to explore. The case studies were focused on 3 or 4 main questions. The first question was to check how these ethical frameworks and standards have been implemented in 3 countries that are Estonia, Serbia, and Australia. And I would say that in general, we'll learn that in Australia, there is a very, very clear and kind of developed framework of youth rights developed around this ethical framework. While, for example, in Serbia, it could be said that the existing principles are based on human values, but not really explicitly. It's not been explicitly said. Why is this important? Because it has implication to various issues, including the way in which the practice will be implemented. And for example, we also explored the types of relations that are considered in these codes, and we learned that various types of relations, including internal, external, are considered, and various types of principles and values are expected to be implemented. What is really important is to say that in one way, we have very high standards and expectations towards practitioners, but we don't have very clearly set the systems of support and support measures and mechanisms to actually apply and implement these values and principles. So I would say this is one of the areas where the future development is definitely needed. And we also need to learn more. This was just the preliminary research. Some of these supporting measures are very clearly structured in some countries, such as, for example, Australia. In Serbia, for example, there is this body that is entitled in monitoring the implementation of the codes, and so on and so forth. Some of the open questions in the end, from my perspective, are actually based on the quality assurance criteria and systems, and how do they assist and facilitate implementation of these standards. And then how can we learn from each other? How can the organizations learn from each other and transfer knowledge, transfer good practice in the future in order to foster better development of ethical frameworks and their better implementation? In the end, how can we make these codes more connected with practice and policy, and how can we make different actors and stakeholders more aware of their importance? Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Slađa. Since we cannot have a crowd applause, at least one from this side. Thank you so much for that. Yeah. I'm pretty sure it wasn't easy to sum this up, since it seems like, and I really appreciated having a chance to have a sneak peek, because I haven't seen any of those researches before. There was one question whether this will be available on the MOOC page. Yes, it will. And Slađa, actually, this is why you saw so much text on the slides, is that Slađa actually prepared them in mind for you to have it on the MOOC, so you can explore in your own time. And there were a couple of questions about research that we will come back to. And we also encourage you, like our viewers, to also ask questions related to content. I know youth research is a very exciting and maybe unexplored territory for many of people. So I'm sure Slađa will be happy to answer those questions as well. But if you have questions regarding the actual content of the research and so on, feel free. So thanks again, Slađa. And we will invite now John to be who is our next speaker, who is actively working as a youth worker in Scottish Highlands. And I can hardly imagine a nicer place to work, but John, you can tell us more about it. So here is invitation and the microphone to you, and the next 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. So, thank you very much, and hopefully I'll kind of answer some of the questions that Slađana's kind of posed. So cool. Hopefully around sort of the framework for reflection and discussion. But firstly, again, let's see if I can share my screen. Fingers crossed I can get this to work. Okay. Is that going to work?
Success.
It's working. Fabulous. That's great. So I think the first thing I need to do is I've got this slide up really because I just wonder whether anyone has ever watched the Deadliest Catch. And for those of you who have not seen the Deadliest Catch, it's about a bunch of crab fishermen up in the Bering Sea, and one of the deadliest jobs in the world. And I was kind of watching this at the sort of same time as Derek asked me to kind of be part of this panel, and I was trying to think of a way to explain what ethics were or what they are. So I kind of came up with an analogy, which is essentially, if I am a ship, ethics function as the rudder on that ship. You know, it keeps me from hitting rocks or running aground and keeps me out of harm's way. You know, it kind of allows me to keep myself right. So a captain on a ship gets lots of information from around them. They then use the rudder to water course so they can keep safe. You know, some of this information they receive, you know, about how to make decisions to turn a rudder might be how close they are to other boats, what the tide is doing, what state of the weather is. Now, all this information they take in helps to build a picture of how they want the ship to behave, and the rudder, you know, allows the ship to be adjusted accordingly to steer the best course. So just like a captain on a ship, I also take in lots of information for my practice, you know, from many sources, which I, you know, to reflect upon and kind of make sense of. So, you know, I can make the best decisions about an approach I want to take or about a dilemma I'm having. you know, in youth work, I'm constantly presented with information, you know, from young people, about young people, from my organisation, from other organisations, from the National Youth Agency. You know, it's this information which supports me to adjust my approach to steer my ship. So anyway, that was just a kind of brief overview. But there we go. So this is me. I'm an area youth officer, and I work up in the Highlands of Scotland. And at the minute, we're getting about 19 hours of daylight. So yeah, it's really nice at the minute. What I want to do is move on to the next slide. If I can get this thing to work. There we go. So the question I want to try and answer is you know, what values is my work based upon? So perhaps a good place for me to start is with my organisation. You know, my organisation is more than just youth work. You know, it has leisure centres, it has an adult service, has a libraries, museums. You know, it's a really large organisation and has a diverse workforce. They do have a code of conduct policy, and they also have a document called role model behaviour, which outlines the type of behaviour and the standard that is expected by the organisation of its employees. It's a very good document. Well, they're both very good documents, but it's not youth work specific or talk about, you know, values and principles that I really need to be thinking about. So if I think about me, you know, not just as an employee of my organisation, but as a youth worker, there are many other places where I get my, you know, get information from that informs my youth work practice. You know, whether it's my personal values, you know, the things that I like, the things that I dislike, sort of my political persuasion, you know, my moral compass, as it were. You know, I've got the historical context of youth work in the UK, what was happening 100 years ago, what was happening 50 years ago, what was sort of happening 10 years ago. You know, I think sort of 10 years ago we had austerity, you know, and it was just obviously a government imposed agenda, and it was really damaging to the sector. My values can be, I suppose, informed and formed from the professional experiences I've gone through, you know, from the courses that I've attended or the books I've read, you know, whether it's completing a degree, having supervision with a colleague. So all this sort of stuff, you know, I suppose what I'm trying to say is my value base is broad, but probably the most simple set of values that I'm guided by is those developed specifically for the youth work sector in Scotland, which I'll get to in a little more detail in a moment. So in Scotland, we have got a code of ethics, and it's written by the Community Learning and Development Standards Council, you know, specifically for youth work. Actually, we've got two versions of the same document because I don't know why, but we have got the full version and we've got a summary version. But essentially, you know, they're documents for the sector, and you know, the full version is very thorough, and it explores each of the guiding principles in detail. Today, I don't have enough time to explore, you know, these guiding principles. I just really want to give a flavour of the summary version, as it has. Well, I quite like it because it's got kind of pictures which are posing ethical dilemmas, really to get people thinking, you know, about their values and that of their organisation. So let's get to the next slide. So yeah, what's the problem here? So this is one of the pictures out of the summary version. You know, we've got a youth worker there dressed, you know, with an orange top on, and in there, you know, it's written quite a while ago, but you know, ethics is still applicable, you know, today as it was a decade ago. But now they got a newspaper in their back pocket, you know, and maybe that youth worker wants to go to the cup final to watch the football. You know, they're really keen on seeing their team, you know, get that far, and hopefully they're going to win. But you know, what this youth worker does is he approaches the group and, you know, says, so I was thinking we don't have to meet in the evening. How about tomorrow afternoon? So, and the question that's posed down the bottom there is, you know, are your service hours and your work patterns organised around your employer, your or the needs of your community? So it's really getting us to think about, you know, why whose agenda is being served, you know, and why why are we behaving in a particular way? You know, who are we really working for? Are we really working for young people, or are we really working because, you know, we want to go and watch the cup final? So yeah, there's quite a number of, there's a picture in the summary version that covers each of the different sort of guiding principles. So it's just a good way to explore with colleagues and you know, and hopefully explain to other people outside the sector what ethics are. So what this code of ethics does is it sort of signposts to the actual document I want to talk about in more detail, which is hold on, can find it, which is this document. So it's the statement on the nature and purpose of youth work. Actually, it's not a document; it's a pamphlet. It's really digestible and it's really easy to understand. It's essentially an A4 sheet that you can fold up, you know, twice and go in your back pocket. So it's really quite digestible. But it's these, you know, what it sort of says in this document in the nature and purpose of youth work. It kind of goes into detail about you know, that youth work has 3 essential and definitive features, you know, which have essentially been agreed by the sector. So 1 second. It says that you know, well, these 3 features are young people choose to participate, that youth work must build from where young people are, and that youth work recognises the young person and the youth worker as partners in a learning process. And to me, these 3 building blocks of youth work are really a definition of how the relationship between youth workers and young people should be constructed and navigated. You know, really should be the basis of our work together. So it's like, well, I suppose moving on from that is like, well, how do I put this into practice? You know, and so what I want to do now is just reflect on these 3 features and what they look like, you know, in practice. And but for the first one, I suppose I need to start with a comparison to kind of contextualize, you know, the first statement that young people choose to participate. So formal education in the UK or in Scotland is compulsory unless young people are homeschooled. You know, young people must attend school. They don't get a choice. If they don't attend, there are consequences for this. And youth work in Scotland and in the UK is vastly different from formal education, just on this statement alone. Voluntary participation in youth work should be viewed as, to me, should be viewed as sacred, you know, and that young people make a choice about whether they choose to participate, and is really vital for establishing like a positive working relationship with them. You know, I've delivered youth work in prisons, and you might think that, you might think that as young people have lost their freedom, they will be forced to take part in the prison regime, you know, which they are, you know, for a number of things. And if they don't take part in the regime, they get punished. But during their association time in prison, you know, which is their free time in the evenings, which is when youth work takes place, they still have an option whether they want to engage with a youth worker or not, you know. The notion that young people have a choice, that they are able to choose freely for themselves whether they want to engage, you know, it gives them agency. Another example of seeing this in action is doing detached work. You know, young people might wave you over, you know, and instigate a conversation, or you know, they may cut short a conversation that you're having with them, you know, walk away, or perhaps, you know, they ignore you completely despite having known you for years. And to me, these are clear signals and healthy signs of voluntary participation in action. You know, that young people are essentially agents of their learning. So the second statement, that youth work must build from where young people are. You know, it's like, well, actually, what does that actually mean? Build from where young people are? And you know, to help explain this, I guess I need to go back to a digital project from 2018 that I worked on, and perhaps give a little more context about my area, Highlands in Scotland. I guess its kind of uniqueness in the UK means it has lots of small towns and very remote villages, you know, surrounded by mountains and lochs, and you know, with really poor transport infrastructure, you know, and young people are essentially isolated by the geography. You know, for this digital project, young people were wanting to use social media to connect with other young people. They wanted to share their lived experience with them and with the wider community. You know, they also wanted to use digital tools to talk with each other and me. They also wanted autonomy to be able to post content on social media as they saw fit, without kind of an organizational filter and everything being checked all the time, Now, they could have done this all on their own, and to be fair, probably would have been a lot easier, but that's not what they wanted to do. Young people wanted support from myself and our organisation to make this happen and kind of bring this project to life, kind of to act as the glue, really. It was a big ask from young people, but it was understanding this and that they wanted, and it's this that what they wanted to do was really the starting point for me to support them to make this happen. So the project was really built from the ground up and built from where young people are. It wasn't some sort of kind of top-down production that was imposed by senior managers or in response to a set of predefined targets or outcomes that I needed to work on. It was based, upon the idea and the wishes of young people and of how the project kind of should work. So I just want to move on to the last statement, which was, that youth workers. Well, youth work recognises the young person and youth worker as partners in a learning process. So really, I guess the first bit, really, I've got a few questions here, is like, well, how do youth workers and young people become partners in a learning process? As a youth worker, are you content in the knowledge that you're not always an expert, that you sometimes don't have all the answers, that sometimes the work can be really messy and uncertain? Are you comfortable and able to show a level of vulnerability to young people that you are teachable? Do we really need to be experts all the time? And I think about formal education and how different it is from youth workers. And as informal educators, we don't need to be experts or kind of this font of knowledge. Some youth workers, on sessions might want to lead from the front, be that expert and that kind of font of knowledge in a group setting. But you kind of need to ask yourself, what sort of space is being created for learning opportunities using this approach. In this type of space, how are we able to be partners, with young people in a learning process if the youth worker is always kind of leading? So I just want to go back to that statement about being partners in a learning process. So now my experience with digital youth work prior to 2018 was non-existent, other than some personal use of sort of social media. And to explain why that is, I need to really wind the tape back to 2011. I kind of mentioned I worked in a prison, and I was in that youth work project in a prison for 4 years, from 2011 to 2015. Where young people aren't allowed access to the internet or digitalization experiences. So there was like this huge chunk of my practice where digital kind of hadn't been on my radar, or part of my practice. Effectively, my practice was kind of sort of locked into a very specific approach as I had to work within sort of the prison rules and boundaries, that were imposed by them. I've been in my current role since 2015, and I'm predominantly sort of behind the desk, kind of most of the time managing staff and projects. So come 2018, when I find myself in a position where my organisation want me to work on a project with young people, which I kind of mentioned about earlier, essentially a project that young people have said they want to lead on and use social media and digital tools. To say I was a little unsure how this project was going to pan out was a bit of an understatement. I didn't even have a concept of what digital youth work was, what its defining features were, or how best to go about supporting young people to achieve what they wanted to achieve. I really felt like a fish out of water, and you couldn't make it up. But to me, this is part of the territory of youth work. Sometimes we don't have all the answers, and it can be really messy and uncertain, but that's okay. But what I do have is my youth work values, and my practice has taught me throughout my career, is just to work with it, work in that zone and be present with young people in that space, even if it means being really uncomfortable. I don't have all the answers, and sometimes I need to go and find out stuff, and I need to be honest with young people about my shortcomings, and when I don't have all the answers, as I believe it kind of demonstrates and models a level of vulnerability, and that kind of human condition that we're teachable, which I believe, are sort of positive attributes to have. But anyway, back to the sort of digital project and linking it to this statement about being partners in a learning process, So after a year of working with young people, kind of working through many complexities and challenges, whether this was about safeguarding, consent, kind of risk versus innovation in a digital space. So I can honestly say I learned loads kind of while working on the digital projects, I learned as much about digitalisation and digital youth work as young people learn through social experiences and sort of working with each other. And what held me in that space was these youth work values that I'm sort of reflecting upon now, And I really do think this is the essence of our values are held by each of us, We take them and use them to guide our ship and navigate through those sort of misty and choppy waters when all is really unclear around us. But just to kind of finish up and hopefully link to the next presenter, if there's a takeaway from my practice with young people, it's really about a commitment to conversation, It's really the building block of the work we do. And what I mean by a commitment to conversation is kind of, if we step back to our values and our principles and think about community and community building and sort of how young people interact and connect with each other, whether it's in a digital or physical space, we can really bring our principles and values, through in a way which isn't, I guess, tied down to a piece of technology and is purely focused on how we work with young people as part of our practice. So, yeah, that's me.
Thanks a lot, John. One applause for you as well. And thank you very much for, as you were actually announcing and really responding to some of the questions and really showing it in practice and actually sharing with us an example of a concrete initiative where this was put in practice. So I think that's very valuable and very relevant. And as you said, it's a very good link to Juha's input that is coming in seconds. Once again, a reminder to use Q&A. We have one more talk and then we will be open for your questions. So, not to take more time, Juha, the floor is yours. Take us to the digital land that we are already in. But anyways, talk to us about the digital land then.
Thank you. Yeah, as is clear, every one of us has been in the digital realm more than we anticipated maybe 2 years ago. And this is the way things are right now. And I think in the last year and a half, we have learned a lot. We've been at it in my organization for a while already. I come from an organization called Verke, and we are the Center for Expertise on Digital Youth Work in Finland. So we are in the very nice position that we get to focus on digital topics all day, every day, and we get to kind of develop things. We are fairly active on the European level as well, but our main task is to work on the competences of the Finnish youth field. So that's where we kind of come from. So I can talk about ethics in digital youth work. I have to at least very briefly say what is or define what digital youth work is. So basically, digital youth work is something that focuses on the digitalization of the youth field, and especially on the youth work practice, as opposed to, for example, the smart youth work that our friends from Estonia employ. They consider more of the organizational level as well. We do that as well, but our focus traditionally has been maybe even too much on the practice. But digital youth work means using or addressing digital media or digital technology somehow in youth work. So whatever you're doing around digital media or whatever you're doing around digital tools, whether you're using them or talking about effects of media on young people's lives, then you are already in the realm of digital youth work. It's a big bag of tricks in the sense that there are a lot of approaches you can take to digital activities, digital approaches, and they can really be implemented into any kind of youth work. But I think the main takeaway for our topic today is this, that digital youth work is and should be always underpinned by the same values and same ethics as youth work in general. So suddenly things don't change completely when we head into the realm of digital youth work, but rather the values and the youth work goals should always be the same. What we often recommend when we talk to practitioners is that if you are setting up a new practice, if you are setting up a new, completely new approach, you should always evaluate whether your digital youth work practice still serves your youth work goals. If it doesn't, then you're doing the wrong things. And it really shouldn't be about the technology itself, but rather it should really be about the youth work. I'm a technology enthusiast. I'm a huge geek and a huge nerd. So I like to tinker with technology just for the sake of technology. But when it comes to youth work, there always needs to be the youth work focus to things. Yeah. And gentle reminder also that even if in COVID times, digital youth work means mostly hanging out in online environments like the Zoom room or Facebook Live, digital youth work can always be also physical. And I find that the coolest stuff happens when there is a mix of environments and approaches happening. So mixing up everything is always good. Digitalization is a wider perspective, of course, in digital youth work. It can be looked at on the impact to employment. It can be looked at from a communication standpoint, and all of these affect youth work in one way or the other. Maybe some viewpoints that are maybe underexplored are how profoundly digitalization changes social interaction of human beings, not just young people, but human beings in general, and the societal impact of that communication. It's really quite a huge thing. And I know some countries are really focused on young people's entrepreneurship, and then you have to take into account what kind of new services and phenomena are rising from digitalization. And if we look at a policy level or a systemic level, it's about digital infrastructure, what kind of devices, technology are being provided to the field. It's about policy and practice, so what guides the work that we do. And it's also about building ecosystems. And now I'm not talking about building new platforms that talk with each other, but rather an ecosystem of competence, of policy that supports the practice, how practice is evaluated using digital technology, how research feeds into what kind of digital approaches we implement. And that's a really complex topic. That's for another day. Today we're talking about ethical standards and codes in digital approaches. And it's not always easy trying to figure out how those existing ethics frameworks that were already mentioned today, how do they transfer and kind of translate into digital approaches? So it's not always a question of directly transferring things, but it's also about translating that. So what does this language of, for example, inclusion or equality, what does that mean for a digital environment or a digital approach? So some questions to explore. First, and maybe one of the most obvious things is separating the private sphere from the professional sphere. And that's about how we practitioners separate our lives in digital environments. What do we share from ourselves? This is a very core question of professional youth work in general. Like, how much do we share of our personality? We always say that our personality is one of the tools, one of the most valuable tools in youth work. But then again, our digital identities have to be kind of limited into what we share for young people. For example, in day-to-day face-to-face practice, we don't share intimate personal details. Most likely, we probably don't share our home address with the kids we work with. And the same applies to digital approaches as well, and especially using social media when we work with young people. How it becomes an ethical question, but also a technical question. Like, how do we separate that kind of personal life from the professional life, especially if the service we are using does not allow us to kind of have two separate identities, but expect us to work on one identity alone. And then we actually come back to the question of using our own personality for youth work. Am I still Juha Kiviniemi when I work with kids on social media? Or am I only Verke? I'm this kind of faceless organization. And then it becomes kind of removed from this personal touch to youth work and to the kind of engagements and those conversations and discussions and dialogue that was also mentioned today. Yeah. Then again, looking at young people's spheres, do we as youth workers feel that it's ethical for us to insert ourselves in all of the spheres that young people inhabit in digital environments? Sometimes it can be very handy. It can be useful for us to interact with young people on the environments that they are. And I completely agree. We do need to work with the environments that young people are already using, or those who need to be at least one of the environments that we employ when using digital approaches. Then again, young people should be also allowed to dictate whether they want us in a certain platform or not. There need to be, again, as with face-to-face work, there need to be, if a young person doesn't want to share an aspect of their lives with you as a youth worker, that is completely their right. Unless you are working with a kid, let's say in social work, that you are kind of in a position to dictate something to them. If you are in non-formal education, in open youth work setting, for example, you have no right to dictate what the young person shares and what they don't. And the same should be applicable in digital youth work as well, and digital environments. There are, of course, huge implications when we start working with social media platforms that are not under our control. There is also the question, who sets the rules? We have to work within the confines of those platforms. If we were to set up platforms ourselves, sure, we can then set the boundaries. We can set the rules on how things work within that platform. The only problem is that it's wildly costly to set up a big platform for social interaction. And it makes no sense in the sense that young people are already inhabiting these certain social media platforms, and trying to compete with these commercial giants, it really makes no sense. Why would the young people come to our platform, our Verke youth work platform, for example, when they can use TikTok, they can use Snapchat and all of these things that all their friends are already there. So getting that critical mass into our platforms, it would be insanely difficult. But it's a question of control. If we set up a group in any kind of social media platform, in a kind of digital environment, we have some amount of control over what happens in that group. But ultimately, the control is out of our hands. So we are kind of beholden to the structures that these social media giants have then. On the other hand, social media platforms may have certain implications on what we can do in that platform. It comes back to, for example, how do we manage our identities? Famous example from the past is Facebook, that doesn't allow separate profiles for work and for private use. Now, some of you might be thinking, like, oh, but a lot of people have a separate account for work on Facebook. Yes, a lot of people do, but that is not allowed by Facebook's terms and conditions. What happened in Finland back in the day was that for one reason or another, Facebook had this one day where they purged a lot of duplicate profiles, and a lot of youth organizations lost their profiles that they've already had spent a lot of effort and time in building up and trying to or making those connections, and those were all gone. On the other hand, some youth workers actually lost their private profiles because Facebook was just looking at, okay, you have a duplicate, and they removed one. So some people were actually banned in their private lives from Facebook. So this can also happen. And Facebook, of course, is not super relevant as an example, but you do have to look at terms and conditions. Are we working in a way that's, or do the terms and conditions allow us to work in a way that we want? A youth worker's reflex is often, well, I can kind of cheat on the rules. Like I can do because it's for a noble purpose. Sure, that's true. Would be super nice if we can bend the rules, but then we come to the fact that we are showing young people we work with that we actually are allowed to bend the rules. Like you shouldn't, you should actually work by the rules and confines of these terms and conditions, but we're actually doing something different because otherwise we can't do youth work. And, it's super important that we can do the youth work. I'm sure also you can see the ethical implications in that as well. It's always a question in professional youth work. What should organizations do to help practitioners do their youth work, to actually apply these digital youth work measures? The problem is creating policy, creating guidelines, and creating support that would be general enough that it would help with, or it would apply with several services at once, but it also needs to actually be concrete enough to be of help without having to practice and study for weeks to figure out how to apply this youth work practice. But if it's too specific for a single approach, single digital youth work thing, it means that when young people's platforms change, they move on to the next big thing, which can be super fast sometimes. No longer is the support applicable. The biggest thing I think organizations can do is they can have a policy that's general, and they can have a blanket policy saying that, okay, you are allowed to experiment and you are allowed to fail within these kind of youth work goals and youth work ethical guidelines that we have in place already. Otherwise, go knock yourself out, do quality youth work. That would be the best thing that organizations can do. Of course, the real situation is a bit more complex than this, but basically this. And finally, there is often the question of balance versus digital and other activities. Here in the slides, there is a guy on his phone and a picture of forest. So this is the most common example, like how do we balance young people's digital lives and how do we balance their other healthy, how do we balance them being healthy with themselves? So the overuse of digital devices. But it's also a question of balancing youth work activities. So are we offering a good balance of digital activities where we maybe reach kids that we otherwise wouldn't reach, that are engaging to other kinds of kids, and then also offering something else? And probably a blended thing would again be the coolest, because then we can offer inclusive youth work to as many kids as possible. Thank you. I hope there are a lot of questions coming in.
Thank you, Juha. And I think it's quite clear that this is not the first time that you're speaking about this. So thank you for that. And I think it's very good to really hear from a practitioner that is not new to this, as maybe many of us are in the past year or two, but that really there is an experience to draw some of these insights from. So that's much appreciated. Thanks a lot. There are some questions indeed, even questions of how to become a digital youth worker, which I'm sure you can offer a sentence or two. But before we get on to the questions and I pass the mic to Darek, I actually want to pass the mic and screen to another person that is here with us, which is Olaja, who is our graphic recorder. And who has been listening very carefully to these inputs, and she probably has already something to show us. Olaja? Here we go, magic in the making. I always find it very difficult then to continue with whatever is going on. You know, we just all get stuck looking at the screen. Yeah, as Veronica says, beautiful as always, indeed. And Olaja will continue working on it, incorporating questions as well and so on. And then once this art is finished, we will also upload it to our MOOC. So thank you, Olaja, for being with us and for capturing the most important moments. And now on to the questions. Darek, they're all yours.
No, the questions are not mine. They are coming from the participants or people who are here in this room. And there are a few questions, maybe not all of them related to actually values and ethics in youth work. But yes, our course is about youth work essentials. So we actually try to sort out things that are relevant for people who are participating in our course. And many of them are youth workers, and many are not yet, or youth workers to be, or are at the beginning of the path to be a youth worker. So everybody is very curious about different stuff that's actually coming from what you were saying, Slađa, John, and Juha. So, there is one question which I find particularly interesting, although we are going to explore it a little bit more in the MOOC, because we have a separate module on it. And Slađa, it's the question to you, actually. And the question is as follows. Could you tell us a little bit more about being a youth researcher? What methods do you use in researching, or what methods is used in youth research? As I said, we will have a separate unit on it in the next module, or the next after the next. I don't remember exactly now, but there will be about youth research, because we always try to connect this three angles of the triangle: youth policy, youth research, and youth work, where young people are in the middle of this. And so how do you become, or what is it about this being a youth researcher, and what methods are used? Are the methods different than other, let's say, social science, or if you can say a few words about it?
Okay, thanks a lot for the question. I think we need another webinar focused on this topic, but being a youth worker in one way, I mean, in my case, I really wear a different hats. I'm also certified youth worker and very experienced practitioner, which helped me to understand how things are working in practice. But I started to deal with young people from the academia, basically. My background is in psychology. I'm specialized in adolescents. So that's how I learned about young people. And I got fascinated about this developmental stage, and I wanted to learn more, and I wanted to test my academic knowledge. That's how I get into the course, which was leadership and developmental youth work, that was developed across ex-Yugoslavia, So youth work was kind of a test phase for me to see how this academic knowledge is working, and how the knowledge that I gained at the university is helping me or not in this completely new and sometimes very unexpected and very dynamic environment. What I learned is that I really need new skills. I need to kind of be able to be flexible and also control the situation at the same time. Both John and Juha mentioned the very core, I would say, of youth work that also has to do with ethics, which is the relationship and personality of youth worker that is actually the main tool. So the role of youth researcher, I would say, that I become again at some later stage, is to kind of gather knowledge, first of all, and to translate this knowledge into the information that is digestible, that is useful to various types of audiences. I would say that my experience, for example, in the youth partnership, also in while doing with the UN agencies, with the Commission and global research agencies, is such that from the role of youth researcher, firstly, you need to be very skillful. You need to know your thing. You need to know the drill. You need to be familiar with the methods. And methods are various. I would also suggest to the participants to check the latest publications on the partnership's website. There are essentials of youth research published there, and very soon my colleague and I prepared the digested version of it and of various studies, and this publication will be called Youth Research, the insights into youth research. So the point of insights is to kind of simplify and digest things about youth research. I don't know if this answers any of these questions, but youth research really complements different roles within the youth sector. But in my particular case, I would say that being the youth research only doesn't help much. Really getting these different hats and getting through different, I was also very much involved in youth policy, getting these different roles and different perspectives really helped me to understand how the section is functioning and, what are the needs and the shortcomings in different segments and aspects.
Thank you. I agree. We can talk a lot about youth research. We can have a separate webinar. We also try in the youth partnership. There is also you probably all know now, there is this podcast series, which is called Under 30, where we actually talk with youth researchers who publish different publications in youth partnership, working with youth partnership. And then we try to talk about it in a kind of, let's say, friendly language, so everybody is able to understand, because I think sometimes this is one of the barriers. People cannot really approach research or get very easily discouraged because it's simply very difficult to understand, very difficult to digest. But it's possible to talk about youth research in a way that people can really follow. And I think in Under 30, we are trying to do it as well.
Absolutely. If I may just mention that since 2010, the partnership actually started, also before that, but the pool of European researchers was established as the think tank, as a group of experts. And since this year, we have this advisory group of seniors. Mm-hmm. And the pool of researchers, I would say, over the years managed to kind of advocate for the importance of youth research at the European scale and also at national level, but also to kind of demystify the role of youth research, right? Not only youth research, but research in general, and also to kind of present this as one of the segments of the youth sector and one of the key.
Okay, there is one more question, Slaja, so don't mute the microphone.
Okay.
It's a simple, very quick question, and it relates to what you were talking about different studies or different resources that are related to ethics and values and of youth workers or of youth work. And the question is, which one of these resources or studies do you recommend to check out first? So what to start with for somebody who is just a budding youth worker, something who is starting?
Mm-hmm. If you want to learn about ethics, I would recommend that you check the slide, I think number 1 or 2, when this little picture is, there is this link. So the knowledge book that was published by the partnership in 2020 contains various papers that are basically focusing on different aspects of youth work, how to become youth worker. One of these papers is basically focusing on ethics, but you can learn a lot of stuff from this knowledge book only, Mm-hmm. And if you want to explore more, you simply open the webpage of the partnership and just scroll in. There are plenty of links, very, short papers and so on and so forth. It's very user-friendly, I would say, and you can find plenty of resources only on the website of the partnership, and then you have different links and different publications. So, but to start with, to learn about youth work, how to become youth worker, what's the role of youth work, and about ethics, this knowledge book, I would say, is very useful starting point. And again, partnership has these very short publications that are called essentials and also insights into youth work, insights into youth policy. So they are super short, very kind of crispy and translated publications. So for the beginners, I would recommend that as well.
Thank you, Slaja. Marietta and Katja are putting the links in the chat, so you can put them.
Thank you.
So you don't have to look through or navigate through the partnership. Great. Good. Thank you. There is another question, which is probably more to John and maybe even to Juha, because it's about digital I would say, digitalization. I would not say digital youth work, but digitalization, which is that most of the people who are living in rural areas, so John, like in your case, are not having enough technological knowledge and internet facilities. I don't know if it's true, but this is what somebody writes. Especially in the period of COVID pandemic, how we can involve them with them effectively, how we can involve them effectively. If there is no knowledge or there is no internet facilities. John.
So it's kind of a really good point, because I think up in Highland, then there is a problem with decent broadband. You know, I live a mile outside of the main city in the Highland, which is Inverness, and I don't even get half a megabyte. So I rely on kind of a community Wi-Fi setup. So and you know, it's not just the established kind of copper network where there's a problem. You know, there's other ways to overcome the sort of the connectivity issue, whether that's kind of using community kind of a Wi-Fi setup, or kind of a satellite, or kind of mobile kind of using a mobile kind of infrastructure to get connected to the internet. So there are kind of there is an issue around accessibility, but hopefully we're definitely kind of on the way there to resolving a lot of that. But there are areas in Highland where you cannot get broadband, or you cannot get a mobile reception, you know, because there's a mountain in your way. It's not possible for some young people where they live. What the schools kind of realized about 6 years ago, is that they wanted to try something slightly different. I suppose they wanted to kind of make sure that you know, obviously the other part of this conundrum is about having devices, you know, and they recognized that that this was an issue, and young people didn't have access to devices, especially those young people that are kind of that are marginalised, or kind of sort of socio-economically, you know, that they're on low incomes, or their families are. So what kind of what happened in Highland is the education kind of got together, and they decided that, you know, as part of a young person's kind of journey through formal education, that everyone will be given essentially a Chromebook. And that is the sort of approach they took. You know, it's like a sort of a systems change, shall we say, kind of a whole ecosystem approach that they took to hopefully kind of addressing the inequalities that exist around internet access and device kind of, and young people kind of having access to a device. So now any young person in school, that sort of, or even at the upper end of primary school, shall we say, 10, 11-year-olds, have you know, they each have a Chromebook, and they're all connected to I suppose the local authorities kind of network. But they can take these Chromebooks home and use them, and they can use them, you know, for up until they leave school, you know, and obviously they have to hand them back. But so when kind of COVID struck, actually in Highland, we was already kind of well positioned, you know, in terms of the infrastructure, and every young person essentially having a Chromebook, you know. So yeah, but I kind of saw what was happening in other parts of the UK, where they, you know, young people didn't have access to devices, or, you know, had connectivity problems. And you know, if what the sort of schools have done is, if young people, you know, are disadvantaged, haven't got kind of you know, the sort of finances to get Wi-Fi at home, then they will provide the dongles that young people need to get online. So there is I suppose in Highland there is an approach that was sort of taken, and sort of 5 or 6 years ago, and that's really kind of paid dividends, you know, in terms of COVID, and kind of making sure that the learning and sort of connectivity and kind of connectedness can continue. So hopefully, I hope that's kind of answered the question. Okay,
thank you. I don't know, Juha, if you want to comment on that, or.
Yeah, I think that's a good kind of approach to take. I think one of the main tasks of youth work is and should be to kind of level the playing field in terms of who has access to what kind of resources. And of course, if we can, as youth workers, we should also provide that technology, or partner up with someone that can. So like giving all the kids Chromebooks, I think it's a really good idea. Could be setting up hotspots for internet access. I think another thing would be kind of if we already have a digital youth work in practice in place, a good idea might be to look kind of behind that practice. So it's not about, let's say, using Snapchat, but what are the goals? Again, what are we trying to achieve? And then figuring out a low-tech as way possible to achieve those same goals. I remember I was in a conference once, was about citizen engagement and youth participation. And one country, they were like, yeah, our kids don't have access to smartphones or internet, so they built all the participation around SMS messages. Okay, yeah, sure. That makes a lot of sense. Wouldn't come to mind in Finland, where everyone has high-speed internet in their pocket. And of course, this everyone is a dangerous slope as well, because not all kids have, even in Finland, access to the technology. So it's also important to identify those kids that don't have that access.
Okay, thank you. I think the next question is also to you, John. How did you go about transitioning from the live to the digital, from the live, let's say, live youth work to the digital youth work? I would even ask the question, which is related to what's happening now when we more and more go from digital to live. It's because I think this also requires certain approaches, and maybe approaches not, but the focus probably is a little bit different. So how did you do it, John?
Very, very bumpily. So it was. How did I do? I guess it was kind of. I'll just go back to kind of the sort of practice example that I used, where it was essentially driven by young people. About this is something they wanted to do. So I just kind of followed their lead and kind of worked within the organisation to try and kind of make this project come alive. And I guess kind of it wasn't just about, for me, looking internally for solutions, although that was part of the sort of, although that was part of some of the solutions, it was also about looking outside of my immediate organisation for support. And some of that was kind of tapping into stuff that was going on in Finland and kind of starting to read material so I could then kind of inform my practice. But I think the thing that kind of, and it is a big shout out to kind of Verke, it's like I've kind of really lent on sort of a lot of the material that I could kind of get my hands on, just to kind of read around the subject. And I guess that these were some of the things that really carried me through that kind of transition from face-to-face work into digital. But it really was broadly kind of mapped around the values and the principles that I held as a youth worker. That's the thing that kind of really carried me through that transition into that digital space, because effectively all, I guess it kind of goes back to that point about, is it face-to-face youth work or is it digital youth work? And it's like, really, I guess I'm kind of at a point where, do we kind of need to differentiate anymore? Is it kind of, because young people, they kind of move through these spaces quite seamlessly, and so they probably don't even conceptualize it as either one or the other. It's just something that they do. So it's about, I suppose for me, it's about me kind of moving through those spaces, in parallel with young people, and I suppose that is how I made that transition, or it certainly didn't feel like that at the time, but it was a bit of a bumpy ride. And I suppose sort of 6 months into that project, then recognizing, this is actually called digital youth work, what I'm doing, because I couldn't even put a name to it. I was just kind of going along with what the group wanted to do. So, and then sort of coming back to the other side now, it's just, I don't know, I've just, I suppose it's like, it's not one is better than the other. It's like, to me, it's about kind of I suppose each space has got their merits, but it's just being able to kind of transition and move through those spaces and not be set down by, now I'm doing digital youth work, now I'm doing face-to-face. They can work side by side and seamlessly, alongside young people to move through those spaces.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think that one thing that when you were talking about youth workers and young people being partners in conversation or building the conversation together, I think one of the aspects of it is also acknowledging in certain instances that young people are much more skilled than you as a youth worker in certain domains, in certain areas, and accept this fact, and as you said, navigate somehow through this. I think this is how you also build relationships. You just, and it's also about learning, which is another aspect. I mean, we as youth workers, we also learn all the time, and young people are a very good source of learning, especially in areas that are maybe not very, let's say, explored by us. Okay, going to digital youth work. I remember we had in this module that we are doing now, we are talking with different youth workers who are sharing their different practices and what they do. And we have Olli, who is from Youth Center Monde from Finland, from Rovaniemi. And I found it really interesting when he was talking about being a youth worker who is doing a lot of stuff digitally or doing a lot of digital youth work. But he always mentioned this thing that, yes, and there are young people coming and they are there and we play games on the internet together, but we are there also physically. So it's the same, it's this kind of interesting stuff that you are at the same time digital or doing digital youth work and also doing not digital youth work. I don't know even how to call it, youth work. Or does it have a name? I don't think so. So yeah, somebody says that the person was thinking about becoming a digital youth worker. Do you have any tips on where and how to start? I guess it's to you, Juha. Or is it something like this? You can only be digital youth work. Is it possible to be only digital youth worker or do only digital youth work?
Sure. It's possible to do only digital youth work. Then again, I don't know if there is such a classification as digital youth worker. I mean, Olli, who was mentioned here, he does a lot of really cool digital stuff around maker activities, around digital games, and he is a youth worker through and through. He is not mainly a digital youth worker, he is really a youth worker. But as far as it's kind of related to the question of where to get started as well, and I think it's complex. It's about figuring out a starting point, but in a way, it's about kind of seeing what the cool kids are doing in two different ways. It's looking at existing practice, in this sense, seeing what the cool kids are doing, like looking at what Olli is doing in Rovaniemi, but also seeing how the young people are using digital media and digital technologies, like figuring that kind of youth culture component out. Then it's about looking at the youth work offering, like what your organization is doing, but also what you are doing. Like your youth work might be wildly different from what I'm used to. Like, for example, I might use music in my brand of youth work. I might use participatory activities, but I wouldn't play basketball with them. Never been my thing. I've done it occasionally, but it's not like in my tool bag at all. So figuring out what your strengths are in youth work and kind of going from there. I wrote experimenting with a purpose, in the sense that not just blindly grabbing at something, but rather try something, then look at what worked, what didn't, like do that evaluation bit. We always talk about, in the youth field, we talk about learning by experimentation, but we kind of forget that evaluation bit sometimes. Like, why did we this time succeed when last time we fell on our butts when we tried a similar thing? So figuring that component out is also crucial in getting started, and then just roll from there, see what you can do.
Okay, thank you. There's one more question which is on the chat, but I'm going to ask it because I think it's related to values as well, valuing yourself as a human being, which is about self-care, about how important is it to the youth worker, this to take care of yourself. Somebody wrote, I feel I need to get away sometimes. I don't know who of you can answer, Slađa.
I guess that we all can. Absolutely. I mean, by the book, self-care is one of the values and principles to be respected. It's in the book, it's in the codes code of ethics, of ethical conduct of every youth worker. So, but the experience, I would say, tells us that we often forget about ourselves, we burn out, we, lose this sense of boundaries. We think that we are supermen or superwomen. We think that we need to meet each and every need in the community. We think that we need to be there 24/7 and so on and so forth. At least that was my experience. And I burned out like big time. So, but I also learned from this experience a lot. Now, exploring and researching the ethics and ethical codes, I really recognize that, yes, this is it. It makes sense. These things are written for a good reason, The thing is that not many youth workers are familiar with ethical codes, and I really appreciate inputs from our colleagues that are really linking these sometimes maybe even abstract values and principles, to daily practice, to our lives, to their work as youth workers, right? So the principles and values are indeed there, as John mentioned, to be our moral compass, to be this not always tangible kind of safe net, if you like, to navigate in the rough seas, but also to make sure that we are going to get best from the process, from this relationship that is two-way process, and that we are going to keep ourselves accountable as well, but also leave enough space for the young person to thrive and to grow. That's why I put in the comment, maybe the summary of this discussion could be that the values and principles are there to make the balance between control and agency on the other side, right? So we need to have control in a way, we need to navigate the process, but we also need to provide space for growth, our growth, but also the growth of young people. The same applies to safety. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Slađa. John, Juha, do you want to comment on it, or self-care? You don't need to. I'm just asking. No, John doesn't. Juha, no. Okay. Thank you. That's it. These are the questions that we collected. I don't know if there's anything on Facebook. Katja, any questions? No. Okay. Cool. Sneža, you have to unmute yourself. We cannot hear you.
No.
No. Okay. Cool.
Okay.
So I guess we are heading towards the end of the webinar. Snežana, I give you the floor to close it.
If you can hear me.
Yes. Now, yes.
Okay, now you can hear me. Okay. Thank you, Derek. Actually, my comment was that they were mostly compliments on Facebook, no questions. So this was really great. So I'm closing by saying thank you to our speakers. I especially enjoyed the journeying from digital and back and forward youth work. And I think what was very important also to highlight is that youth work is youth work. And of course, there are some specificities, but some of the essentials of values and ethics and self-care and so on are present everywhere. So thank you for kind of highlighting that as well. And thank you for being with us. I think we continue. This is really a self-evaluation, but I think we continue with really cool speakers and engaging webinars. And once their recording is posted, I hope many more people will benefit from it. We will also have Olaja's final visual very, very soon, so we'll be able to see that. And in the meantime, watch this space. There will be a new unit opening of the MOOC next week. And we continue, and we bring you a new webinar next Wednesday where we have more engaging speakers. So just stay with us and follow us throughout. And thank you to the speakers and to all of you watching here and on Facebook and to my colleagues and how it goes. Thank you.